Yeah, all good.
Amazing, amazing. Well, okay. By the way, Andre, I finished the work I was doing in the studio, of course, in Fly Sound, and
Hmm.
it's awesome. Yeah, I kind of finished the work on the movie. I mean, 90% of it is done. The other 10% will be
Nice.
done between now and September. So
Hmm.
I'm like, whoo, in another level of stress. Now a lot more relaxed. However, I'm a little bit tired right now because, I mean, when you're a father, it's not like you have so much time to chill like in life. Um, So, anyways, everything is amazing. I'm really grateful to God, to the universe, to everything for everything we have. I'm grateful to be here with you guys, and so let's share some conversation and make this time worthwhile. Um, and so again, I changed my plans. I was going to deliver now a lecture I made that is about layering, but I changed my plans because there is few people, and I think it's smart to deliver that when there is more people here. So tell your friends, colleagues, hey, next week let's try to meet with Leo because he has something important to share with us, and I think it's going to be good value. That's why for now I'm going to go to the electronic music conversation I had. So in the conversations we have been having about, let me make sure that I'm sharing the screen with you. Yes, in the conversation that we have been having about, wait, by the way, I know some tip here. Let me just do this quickly. A tab. Yes. Yep. Yep. In the conversations we've been having about about styles and genres in general, I was trying to sort of like present big questions. I mean, bigger questions. Like for example, in the Latino conversation, we discussed like, hey, um, what does it means? Why does such a small culture like Latin culture became so mainstream in the music world? In the moment of the discussion of pop music, we had a conversation like, hey, what is the importance of postmodernism in the evolution of pop music and what does that mean? Great, we did that. And in each kind of like micro compartment that we were studying, I just wanted to sort of like present a university level question, what is the meaning of this in the context of what we're doing? In the case of electronic music, I sort of want to explore kind of like, I mean, it for me the question why did this become so huge is not relevant. uh, for me the question of in general the size of electronic music, I don't have a question about that. The main question I have, it's kind of like why the aesthetics of electronic music looks like that and feels like that if most of the instruments that were invented for the electronic music world were created to replace real instruments. Like, I mean, the reason why all these instruments were conceived in the first place is because people wanted to replace an orchestra. So, kind of like the question that I'm asking today goes more towards the fact, like, why the aesthetics of electronic music look how it look like, given the fact that electronic instruments were created to replace real instruments. Uh, I have to warn you, and that's also why I'm using this little window that I have so little people here and that Andre have to leave earlier. So basically, it's kind of like a private lecture for Lala, in a way, and for Andre. Um, in the last year, not in the last year, when you guys were in foundation, we had a conversation about the history of synths. I warn you that we will see some of that material again, but in an improved form. I mean, if you were not in that synth lecture, it would be amazing because then it would be the first time I deliver this to you. But if you were in that synth lecture and I repeat a little bit of material, I'm sorry for that. It's just there is so much lectures I have to build that sometimes it's impossible not to repeat something. I've been trying to do my best for that. Um, by the way, I use this opportunity to remind to Andriuja that there are some deadlines that have already been passed. So far, only 2 people have delivered to me this like eclectic EP, and many people owe me a lot of stuff for this particular subject. Don't fall asleep on this because I need to get your work so I can grade you and so you can move on to the next year. So, and
Okay.
if anybody has an academic debt with me, we need to close this week, please. I will in the next 3 hours after this lecture ends. I need to wait for my lecture on the DPO that will happen in the night, and so I will have 3 hours, and I will write to all of you that have any issues with me, and I will confirm. So worry not, we will be able to fix it. But yeah, let's just focus so everything goes smooth. Okay, great. So let's get this started. Well, I'm not going to pretend, just like we did on the hip hop lecture. You two guys, I don't think you were on the hip hop lecture. I don't remember, but if you were on the hip hop lecture, I said in that moment that I'm not an expert in hip hop, and I don't want to pretend that I'm an expert in electronic music, even though the majority of music I hear nowadays is electronic music. But anyways, I don't want to say like, hey man, I know everything I'm saying. I'm kind of like some static guy in some way who has some ideas, and I want to share them with you. Will this change your perception about electronic music? I don't think so. I think it will just add some extra information that it would be cool. But I'm in a better position to speak than in the case of hip hop, of course, because again, like I was telling you, electronic music is a very big part of my life. It has been a very part of my life for ages. I was hating hip hop the majority of my life, kind of. And then I came to appreciate it sort of when I started teaching here, something like that. It's when I started appreciating hip hop. But electronic music, I've been in love with electronic music, and I've been making electronic music since the year 2006 or something like that, I think. So I've been doing this a lot, and I enjoyed it very much. And I just wrote an album on electronic music, which was the soundtrack I just did. And I love this. And of course, I'm in a better position to speak than in hip hop. But again, if I'm an expert on something, that thing, it's rock music. Like, that's kind of how it works. So let's move on. So if we're going to approach to the task of building an interesting lecture about electronic music, what should we do? What should we follow? What line of historical line should we follow? Well, the rise of electronic music has transformed the way we experience live music events. These are kind of like three ideas of what we could do when we're going to build electronic music lecture. You know, one thing we could do is to understand the evolution of shows and live events in electronic music. So in the past, concerts were about the musicians on stage and the instruments being played, but now, because of electronic music, concerts have become immersive experience that engage all the senses. So one thing one can do when you study electronic music is to study the history of the rave, you know, as an experience, kind of. The other option we can, I remind you that I'm trying to look for these big university level questions. The other thing one can do is to kind of like focus on the following. Electronic music has revolutionized the way we think about musical composition. And that's the angle that I want to focus on. Why the aesthetics is like that and how those aesthetics changed everything. Because in the end, electronic music changed rock. Electronic music kind of like created the first floor for hip hop. Electronic music kind of like changed even folk music. I mean, everything has been changed since the arrival of electronic music. So we're going to kind of be always thinking about what traditional music was always limited by the physical limitations of instruments and the ability of the human performance. But with electronic music, I mean, you can do anything you want. Composers can create whatever texture you want and manipulate them in real time to do some crazy layered composition. So that's the angle I decided to focus. Another angle that you can think of is electronic music transcended national and cultural boundaries and became a global phenomenon. Then the question would be, why not asking this sort of university level question again, which is, why did electronic music became a truly global phenomenon? And I decided not to do that because I think that's sort of self-explanatory. I think the reason why electronic music is so huge is the same reason why phones or cars are so huge. We love technology. I mean humans. And yeah, wherever technology goes, culture goes. I mean, and has been the same, has been like this forever. So that's why for me that was not such an important question to answer, because it seemed like logical. From techno in Berlin to house music in Chicago, electronic music has spread around the world, taking on new forms and merging with local sounds and traditions. So this has given us many global electronic music phenomenons that it's a part of our culture. But I didn't thought this was such an interesting question. So the question I decided to focus on is why electronic music revolutionized the way we think about musical composition, and what's the deal with electronic music aesthetics, and how did we go to where we are there. So if we go and search like a definition of what is electronic music, you will get something like electronic music is a genre of music that is created using electronic and digital technology, such as synths, drum machines, samplers, and computers. It emphasizes on the use of electronic instruments and production techniques over traditional instruments and recording methods. Of course, this is super relative because many of electronic music songs are heavy on the use of samples, and sometimes those samples are real music samples and real instrument samples. But I mean, the general principle, if you think about the pioneers of electronic music, these were people who were sort of like, grabbing scenes and crafting them and building stuff from the ground up, purely electronic. Electronic music has a broad range of subgenres, of course, and styles, and it has developed over several decades and continue to evolve with new technological advancements. So just like we did on the hip hop lectures, I don't remember if you were on the hip hop lectures, but if you were there, you may remember it. If you don't were there, I think that a good way to proceed is that I'm going to be asking some questions to myself, and I'm going to be trying to answer them. And of course, your help or ideas are super important to me because, I think that in some aspects, maybe you know more of this better than I do, but in any ways, that's how we're going to proceed. I have a couple of books here, like all the time lately. I'm trying to make a collection of books for you, and every time you click on here, it would always take you to my virtual library in my Yandex Disc. So you have the Electronic and Experimental Music, Technology, Music, and Culture by Tom Holmes. It's one of the books I used to get many of the ideas I got. And the other one is Modulations, A History of Electronic Music, Throbbing Words on Sound by Peter Shapiro. It's another book that I got you there. If you ever want to expand this information and you want to see more, just go there and hang out. So now there is another important resources here that I share with you. And this, I really, really beg you to consider looking at this particular book. The Welsh Synthesizer Cookbook is an amazing book. The course that I gave to the foundation on synthesis is based on this particular book, and it's amazing book about synthesis. I mean, it really explores the whole question of synthesis very deeply. Like you can see here, it's like you cannot see anything. But yeah, I mean, it just really goes like on what oscillators do and what are what happens, what are the formants, like how different harmonics are created, combined to create a unique timbre. What is the meaning of a sawtooth? How a sawtooth is, like what does it mean, like sync, MIDI sync, everything. Like it's really every aspect of synthesis, types of synthesis. It's covered in this book. It's amazing book. I really recommend it. And the other thing I recommend you to check out is this. There is this magazine called Sound on Sound, and they have made an article series on synthesizers that are really great. I mean, this is like a lot of articles here only dedicated to synthesis. So whatever, if you ever want to jump around and see something extra about synthesis, this is a great place to be. The articles of Sound on Sound about it. So that would be really cool. So if we're going to try to understand the history of electronic music, we would this is sort of like a timeline kind of thing. So we sort of have an idea of what can be the history of electronic music. We should begin by discussing the early technological developments that led to the creation of electronic music. That's the part that maybe you may remember from the foundation years that I discussed, but I have made these slides better, so we're going to discuss them again. I hope that is not boring. So you need to talk about the telharmonium, the theremin, and other early electronic instruments. You need to also, if you're going to start thinking about electronic music, you need to think about how it was used as a classical music resource initially. And you will see that a lot of the reasons why electronic music is how it is nowadays is because it started as an arm of classical music, actually, which is quite interesting. I mean, I don't think it's so expected for so many people to think about this. We need to discuss the concept of background music or furniture music, it was called, the work of the French composer Eric Satie, which envisioned something like music that could be heard but not actively, like what we call nowadays elevator music or ambient kind of thing. It's like music that doesn't engages all your senses, or maybe you can kind of leave it on the background. This is a very early 20th century development by a guy called Eric Satie. And yeah, I mean, if you're going to discuss the history of electronic music, you should stop by background and furniture music a little bit and discuss it. We're not going to discuss it so deeply, but I'm making here a timeline of like what are some things that somebody who is trying to understand how electronic music is and what electronic music is that should Google to put together and sort of like to in order to paint a picture. If you're going to discuss the history of electronic music, you need to work on my currently favorite area, which is film scores. I'm like Andrei, by the way, heard part of you couldn't hear so much, right, when you were there with me, right? Because I was having technical issues, Andriuja, right?
Oh, what do you mean?
No, when you were with me and we were mixing in Fly Sound, you couldn't hear so much of my soundtrack, right? Because there were some technical issues, correct?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, Dimitri came back when you were in St. Petersburg. And yeah, it was amazing, man. Like he heard everything. We had a really deep time there. Like all the technical issues were sorted. And yeah, it's a pity that you couldn't be there. There will be another set of sessions around August or something, and I will invite you there. But
Okay.
when we're gonna discuss electronic music, we need to discuss how early film scores, which is again my new favorite area of work, have kind of evolved into the development of electronic and ambient music. How composers like Debussy and others used new technologies to create music that was synchronized with the on-screen action. So, if we are going to talk about the history of electronic music, we need to talk about how it related with film and how the early development of film music kind of like affected a lot how electronic music ended up being. If we're going to discuss the history of electronic music, we need to discuss the rise of something called musique concrète, which is a form of music that uses recorded sounds and manipulation of techniques to create new sounds and compositions from something that was already recorded, like a dog barking or a car driving around, something like that, and then manipulating that so we actually get into something new. Of course, if you're going to discuss the history of electronic music, you need to discuss the creation of the first modular synthesizer made by Robert Moog, and which became popular in the 60s and 70s. And you need to talk about the emergence of disco in the 70s and how it influenced electronic music. You need to spend some time discussing techno, house, and other electronic dance music genres from the 80s and 90s. And of course, if you're going to kind of continue this timeline, this history of electronic music, you need to discuss how electronic music is a genre or like a kind of like a group of musical aesthetics that are changing constantly with new subgenres emerging all the time, and electronic music becoming more important in our popular culture. In the 80s, we had the emergence of hip-hop thanks to drum machines and samples. In the 90s, we have the growth of electronic dance music and subgenres like techno, trance, and house. In the 90s as well, there was an electronic music kind of arriving to pop culture and taking over. And I don't know if you noticed, but all of a sudden, pop music became something that is kind of strictly electronic, and the same it happened with hip-hop. Not necessarily was like that all the time. Well, with hip-hop, it's a bit different, but with pop music, it was not necessarily like that. And around the 2000s, everything became more diversified. We started having more dance and electronic dance music festivals. And yeah, electronic music keeps evolving and just continues moving forward. So this part, I warn you, again, if you remember very well those foundations lectures, maybe you will find a little bit of repetition here, and I'm sorry for that. I really hope that you two guys were not the ones who were in those lectures, and then it would be super fun. But if not, bear with me, and then
Definitely Lala wasn't there.
Definitely, you were not there, or you were there?
Definitely Lala.
Lala was there.
Foundation.
I wasn't, you mean?
Wasn't, yeah.
Maybe, I don't know.
It wasn't?
Ты была на ФАДе?
Да.
Конечно,
Натуре?
она была. Да. Но вопрос это, если она была в это именно лекция. Но все равно, это не 100% то же самое, но there is like, some things that will be repeated because, I mean, again, I'm a human being and I just cannot create unique things forever. So, anyways, but I think...
Повторение — мать учения.
А?
Повторение — мать учения.
Да, я знаю, but I really try to avoid this. Like, I don't know if you have noticed, you have been with me in a million lectures and I have barely repeated something. I hope that I can continue like that. So anyways, this thing, obviously you remember, like what makes a possible electronic music is this little phenomenon. Great, I can grab complex waveforms and separate them into their individual components, and then I can do a lot of stuff with those individual oscillators. Hooray! So that's obviously not news. You obviously remember this video. Everybody has seen this video that has been with me. Lala, if you don't remember, I know that Andre remembers this video because I remember showing it to him. Lala, if you don't remember it, let me know and I'll show it to you. If you remember it, I'll skip it. Do you remember this?
I guess no.
Okay.
Там
Look.
повторяют, звуки с помощью...
Yeah, the point is that, like, how come we can have electronic music instruments? Because complex waveforms can be decomposed into simpler waveforms. So something kind of like this. Like, you see, tell me if you hear the audio.
What a sine wave looks like.
You hear the audio?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, a sine wave looks like that. and when you hear it, it sounds like in a certain way. Sawtooth wave looks like that,
And this is what a sawtooth wave
sounds like
sounds
this.
like. The sawtooth wave can be decomposed into a sum of sine waves of different frequencies.
And anybody who wants to understand how is it possible that we make electronic music needs to be able to visualize this. If I have a sawtooth wave, I can decompose the sawtooth wave into a lot of sine wave components and sum them together and get a sawtooth wave. But the important thing is that I am summing individual little sine waves. And that's what a synth is doing, basically. It's just grabbing a lot of individual little sine waves and summing them together. So basically, I just grabbed all those little sine tones, summed them together, and those sine tones were unique for each one of the... I mean, if I want to make a sawtooth wave, the sine tones that I need to grab are going to be particular. If I want to make a triangle wave, the sine tones that I'm going to need to use are going to be different ones, etc. Do you understand what I mean with this, Lala, right?
Yeah.
Of course. Great.
Yeah.
In that book of Welsh, of Mr. Welsh, there is a really powerful kind of explanation of what I just described. And I covered this in the new lectures that I'm doing for Foundation nowadays. But I just want to show you something quickly here. This is in the, I think Robert Welsh is his name. Yeah, you see, like in the new Foundation, in my new lectures of Foundation, we create a sawtooth wave from the beginning. So we grab like a 440 hertz sine tone, and we sum it with a 880 hertz sine tone, and we get something that looks like this. It's kind of almost like a sawtooth. And then when you add another like 1,320 hertz, then you get something that it looks even more like a sawtooth. And then when we add all of these partials, they're called like that, in that amplitude. That's the important thing. Then we get a sawtooth wave. So theoretically, with a synth, you can create any sound, and that's amazing. And that's something that you guys, as third-year students, super great understand. I just thought that it was important to discuss for the last time. It's like, hey guys, like if you're going to create electronic music, all of that is thanks to this principle. And of course, that applies also to a trumpet. Like if you have a trumpet, you know, you can just get to the sound of a trumpet by grabbing the sine tones that you need and select the partials that represent better the timbre of a trumpet, and then through sine tones you can arrive to a trumpet. And what you need to know about this is that synthesizers create sounds electronically using their analog or circuitry or code, and they were created to replace orchestral elements. So obviously a synthesizer is something that synthesizes sound. You can create synthesis by working subtractively or additively, or FM modulation or AM modulation or wavetable. There are a whole bunch of different types of synths processes that can produce like the sound that you want. And you know, they're typically played with keyboard, sequencer, etc. Now, when we had this lecture in the Foundation back then, we had a cool conversation which was like, is the mind capable of infinity? And so we spent a little bit of time thinking about the fact that, hey, you know, synths produce potentially infinite sounds, even though, very interestingly, they were created to represent some very finite sounds. So that's an important thing that you have to think about there when you're thinking about the electronic music aesthetics. And the first question that I wanted to ask, you know, electronic music, I hit my head. Electronic music instruments were created to replace the orchestra, because the point is that people, when you are going to put an orchestra to perform a show, you need to train 60 musicians. But if you can do all of this with one synth, then you can simplify the process of performing a classical music piece. And so I think that one of the things that we need to think about when we think about the history of electronic music and how electronic music came to be together in modernity, remembering that it all started to serve classical music and to repeat what classical music was doing is an important part of the ethos of the electronic music world. The ethos is kind of like, the word ethos means the philosophy or the principles that base the electronic music world. I think the electronic music world is closer to the classical world than rock music or something like that. Like, in some way, I mean, of course, the electronic music is a whole universe, and it's really hard to generalize. But when we're working with it, we're working with timbres that are kind of like approaching towards an orchestra. And what do I mean by that? That they're very rich and almost infinite in nature. Just like our minds. I mean, we can think about almost anything. A synth can almost do anything. And so the cool thing about the synth world is that it doesn't have the limitations that the acoustic instrument world has that define the way it sounds. So why does electronic music sound how it sounds? One of the reasons is because it was designed to replace orchestral elements, and then this created a whole philosophy around it. And the second reason why it sounds how it sounds, or one of the reasons why it sounds how it sounds, is because it gives us the capacity to produce almost infinite amounts of sounds, and because it has no limitations, it sort of approaches more to the wildest human explorations that we can do that have no limitations of timbre like rock or, I don't know, like folk music or something like that. So this is kind of some ideas I was sharing about like how big infinity is and how big a number is. I mean, these are some conversations. The point I wanted to make with that previous slide is for you to remember how amazing it is that synths can produce almost any sound, and that obviously, and they can produce it because of what I showed above, right? Because of these Fourier transformations. And obviously this will affect the timbre, the aesthetical choices that an electronic musician will make, because the sky is the limit and you can almost do anything you want. So in principle, synths can create unique sounds, but synths were created to imitate real sounds, like I was saying before. So if we study a bit of the history of how these things came together, we can maybe get a better perspective on how to make electronic music, how to think about electronic music, how to put ourselves in the brain of the electronic music maker. So let's go. So what are the origins of electronic music? Let's go and see that. So let's follow the footsteps of history, like I was saying in this presentation. So you may remember this from the foundation. This slide, Imina, is from the foundation. I remember this. Like in the past, there were things like music boxes, but obviously these are not electronic music instruments. The oldest thing I found that can be connected to electronic music or some sort of thing like that, I don't know if you remember that when we discussed it 3 years ago, but there was something called the Archimedes automatic wind instrument, which is like kind of like, it was found in Baghdad, around the 9th century, and imagine like a kind of like a construction or some sort of house that had a lot of inner chambers, and when you blew up some air would take different paths and then produce different sounds that of course are not like a synth, but I mean that was very interesting for the 9th century. I mean, to hear something that was sort of like generated in the moment by some sort of construction. But anyways, there was nothing like an electronic instrument until the invention of electricity, obviously. And these things like these machines, that's mechanical devices, are obviously not electronic music instruments. They're just mechanical instruments that are repeating some patterns. That's why before the 19th century, there is kind of like nothing to discuss about electronic music at all. So electronic music developed in the early 20th century in response to new audio and electrical technology and emerging aesthetic ideas about music, structure, format, and content. The first era of electronic music is focused on the invention of performance instruments that could be played real time before an audience. So basically, initially, the first steps that we're giving into electronic music, like I was saying a couple of minutes ago, were in the spirit of trying to replace the orchestra in order to perform something right away. The work of inventors and composers initially was very experimental. And yeah, people were trying to show that you can manipulate electric signals and use this to compose music. And imagine how freaking revolutionary this was back in the day. I mean, for us right now, it's like so stupid and we don't think about it so much. We're not shocked about this. But I mean, making music with electricity, it would be something kind of like if I tell you, guys, I found a way to make music with water, and you would be like, really? Like, and then I can make any sound with water, and you would be shocked if I show you this. The same was happening with electricity back in the day. Of course, things that are connected to electronic music that happened before World War II are kind of largely unknown, so a lot of these things was lost in time because few recordings were able to be made. So many of the things that happened in electronic music before World War II are kind of not known. When you're thinking about the first instruments inside the electronic music world, you will start thinking about the theremin, the ondes martenot, we will discuss this later, the Hammond organ, and these were very like pioneering instruments that, were developed even before circuitry or transistors were developed. The period of technical development in electronic music history can be divided in 6 generations, they say. We will discuss these generations a bit later. The business of electronic music instruments have grown over time through innovation, imitation, diffusion, and substitution of products. Obviously, it's like an ever-evolving thing. New technologies replace old ones, but they're not immediately adopted by everybody. And so it happens a lot that older technologies are used like decades later because in the moment nobody understood what they can be done with this. So there is this kind of like lapse between new developments and the usage that is really interesting in electronic music. And it affects a lot of things. Do you remember we saw recently this thing of gorillas and how they used this very like 80s synth just to make the beats for Clint Eastwood's song? And I mean, this was something that was supposed to be innovative in the 80s, but it became innovative in the 2000s. So this happens a lot. Successive generation of products overlap a little bit, so each generation eclipses the previous one. But again, there is kind of like this, there's something really cool in the electronic music aesthetics. Remember that we're trying to answer that question, why it looks like that, which is like, things really don't go obsolete in electronic music. Like, you see, you can grab a 80s synth right now and it would just become a hit in the current moment, and everybody would be shocked to hear this sound, and it would feel like as if you're hearing a new sound, but it was all done from the 80s. So there is a lot of overlap between old and new technologies, and that's really part of the aesthetics, by the way. It's kind of like timeless if you think about it. Like when you hear the soundtracks of the 70s of films and stuff and you hear them now, it just feels like it was done yesterday. Example of early electronic music includes the telharmonium, the tarautonium, the Hammond, the theremin, the ondes martenot, like I said before, and vacuum tube oscillators such like the Audion piano and the Novachord. If you continue this timeline of the history and what made electronic music possible, people initially were kind of like starting to make experiments in the 19th century with electricity. And there is a guy called Philip Reyes that in the year 1834 and 1874, I mean, that's when he lived, sorry, he developed the first telephone in 1861. And well, this proved that sound could be transduced, converted into electrical energy, transported via a cable, and then reproduced on the other side. So this was a very big deal in terms of the developments that allowed electronic music. There is a guy called Elisha Gray that invented the telegraph, and there was some, people who could Elisha Gray didn't invented the telegraph. This was a Graham Bell invention, excuse me for that. Elisha Gray was a person who experimented with the telegraph as a system that can transfer different types of frequencies. So they were like musical telegraphs initially, which had 2 telegraph keys, and each one with an electromagnetic kind of strip of metal. And so people initially were doing electronic music with the telegraph, actually. And Gray created versions of his musical telegrams, which have more like piano-like keys. And then there's a guy called Ernst Lawrence that developed sound-generating circuits. Something like a proto-oscillator, something like that. And then there were, you see, there was even a guy in the Civil War era. That's 1860s or something. No, sorry, a bit later, 1890 something. That was showing that you can operate musical instruments remotely through a telegraph. So he would send a telegraph signal to a Gray's machine that was on the other side, and then he would remotely operate it. I'm telling you this so you think like, okay, all of these developments feel very modern, but in the beginning of the 20th century, people were already remotely controlling electric generators of sound that they couldn't record because we didn't have any recording medium, but we could already do this at the beginning of the 20th century. And yeah, I mean, the same happened with pianos or pipe organs. So basically, yeah, that's really interesting that there was a whole wireless, or not wireless, but remote electronic music making before the even 20th century started. And yeah, and if you would follow the timeline of inventions that are important in order for you to start building like a platform for electronic music, you have like the invention of direct current around the year 1900s, the vacuum tube around the 20s, the solid state transistor around the 60s, the integrated circuit around the 70s, the microprocessor in the 80s, and in the 90s you had the microprocessor like in its full form like we know it nowadays. So the first kind of like electronic music instrument that is sort of recognized, or one of the first, together with the theremin, of course, is the telharmonium. And we discussed this in the foundation. I really remember that conversation, but I don't know if you were there, so I just run through it. The electrical organ was invented. This electrical organ was invented by a guy called Tadeusz Cahill. And what you need to know that is funny is that the telharmonium was a whole building, you know, and it was located in the New York. I don't remember exactly where. I think I write it later, but it was like the New York more contemporary art museum. And so people would come there to experience this performance. And he was working with these gigantic motors that had like very large magnetos inside of them. And it produced electricity to a large set of motors. It converted music into sound via telephone receivers that were rotating. So you had spinning wheels that were surrounded by electromagnetic fields. And those wheels were made to spin at the rate of the pitch of each note. The telharmonium was shut down because it started to catch secret Navy radio transmissions due to its enormous electromagnetic field. So the army started complaining that it could catch secret communications between the boats and the bases that were around in the Hudson Bay area in New York. And so it was asked to be switched down by the American Army, and that was the end of the telharmonium. The Hammond organ is an important part of the history of electronic music. It was invented by a clockmaker who had a clock company called Hammond Clock Company. And well, later this person started to pay attention into musical instruments. The first model was introduced in 1935. And it had 61 notes and a pedal board. And it became really popular, and it was kind of like core in the jazz, gospel, rock, and blues world. We still use a Hammond organ today. Actually, the day I gave this presentation, it was a couple of weeks ago. The day after, wait, let me just show you. The day after I saw that presentation, well, I think it's going to be hard to find it right now. Короче, ничего. I decided not to show it. I saw a Hammond organ the day after I get this presentation, the first day. So it was really cool. So it uses, I saw it in a studio in Fly Sound where we were with Andrei. The Hammond organ uses like sound generating system called tone wheels. So there are these wheels that spin, and each one corresponds to a certain pitch. I'm going to just skip a little bit the explanation and show you a video of how it looks like, because it's pretty cool. It's kind of like, you see, these wheels are spinning, and you will see it's very noisy mechanism. So he needs to fix that. So this is kind of how a Hammond organ looked like. And again, this thing can be from the 30s or something. So it has this motor that is rotating, very mechanical device. Vacuum tubes all over the place.
Stink bug, hello. So the internals look very similar to some 16mm projectors.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not going to go through this. I just wanted to leave you this video here so you can see sort of like how the mechanisms look like.
I'll let it sit for 2 more days.
Well, anyways, that's about the Hammond organ. Another instrument that comes here is the
Musical
Ons,
instruments often take decades.
the Ons Martenot. And actually, we did not spoke about this in the foundation, I'm sure. It's something that I built for the new lectures. And it's interesting, and I would like to watch a little bit of that video because sometimes, just like I said before, sometimes instruments fall into forgetfulness. I mean, people forget about them for decades, and then they come back later with a vengeance in the future, just to kind of like claim their spot in the history of music that they deserve. And this is a good case, and we will see in a moment why. The Ons Martenot is an electronic music invented in 1928 by a guy called Maurice Martenot. It's played by pressing a keyboard and moving a ring along a wire that controls the pitch. It had like a lot of special functionalities that other instruments of the time didn't. Was extensively used in classical music around the 30s and 40s. And yeah, it has a manual oscillator, a speaker, a set of filters, and a ribbon controller. Like, I mean, it was really, really, really out of the times. You know, it was really interesting.
Musical instrument.
Wait, I remember before I watched this video, I remember that I had a video of the Ondes Martenot somewhere. Wait, RCA mark. Wait. So let me 1 second put you up that video. I don't know why it's not here. I remember having it, but maybe I added later and I'm just crazy. Wait. Yeah, let me just put it there because it's a really cool. I think it's this one. The one I wanted to show you is this one.
No.
Wait, I know that you're not hearing right now. I will play in 1 second. Let me just insert this video and we continue. So let me insert this video here. So you can have an idea of how it looked like and how it felt. Nice acoustic space there they have.
Ici, nous sommes devant un instrument formidable, c'est un Ondes Martenot. Parlons-nous un peu de cet instrument.
Oui, c'est un instrument formidable parce que c'est un instrument extra. Entre 1926 et 1980, il va changer, évoluer, il va suivre les modifications technologiques qui apparaissent avec le XXe siècle, rendant obsolètes certaines techniques mises en place au début de sa fabrication. Il est magique parce que Maurice Martenot, son créateur, a jeune que...
I just wanted to show you a little bit how it looks like, this instrument, how it feels. And I mean, this guy will explain like how it works and what is going on inside there. We don't have to see this, but what I want to show you is how basically the
Musical instruments.
Let's hear what this man wants to say. It's a good, cool argument.
Musical instruments often take decades to settle into their final form. And during that time, they're quite vulnerable. A fully mature adult instrument requires a whole network to function successfully. Professional players, manufacturers, teachers, repair technicians, composers, publishers, and perhaps most importantly, a rank and file of amateur players whose...
So this diagram that you're watching there, it's one of the reasons why electronic music sounds how it sounds as well, because of this network of people in between, this relationship in between instrument manufacturers, professional players, publishers, composers, people who can fix the things, amateur players, teachers. Electronic music sounds how it sounds because certain instruments become popular or not. And nowadays there is the world of software and this changes everything. But of course, we're having a conversation sort of about what happened before the 2010s, something like that. And this kind of like relationship between all these parts will tell us a lot about why electronic music sounds how it sounds.
Support allows all those other professions to flourish. Until those things are firmly established, a new instrument is always in danger of falling into neglect and ending up friendless in some sad corner of a musical instrument museum.
Voici une voix toute nouvelle, celle du dernier né de l'orchestre, l'instrument d'onde musicale.
All of this was especially true for the Onde Martenot, introduced to the public in 1928 and one of the first ever electronic musical instruments. It has a really complex design with multiple unusual speakers and a volume control mechanism made from some mysterious ingredients rumoured to include gunpowder. When its creator, Maurice Martenot, died unexpectedly in a car accident in 1980, the instrument's fate was left hanging in the balance. There were fewer than 100 people worldwide who knew how to play it, and the instruments themselves, mostly handcrafted by Maurice to a wide variety of specifications over the years as he tinkered with his design, started falling into disrepair, with fewer and fewer people left who knew how to fix them. So teachers couldn't find instruments for their students to practice on, and the few schools that had started to teach the instrument were forced to close. Things were looking bleak. To understand how an English rock musician helped turn things around, potentially saving the instrument from its lonely fate, we need to understand just what's so special about this remarkable instrument. And it's not, as you might expect, so much about the sounds it makes, as about the way they're played.
So, in short, the guitarists of Radiohead started using the Onde Martenot, and this brought this instrument back. That happens a lot with electronic music. It's like somebody influential rescues an instrument, and then that sets a trend. And that's what I wanted to say about the Onde Martenot. I really recommend to watch this video. It's really fascinating. It's really cool. The Rhythmicon was a very early electronic music instrument developed by a guy called Henry Cowell, and Lev Theremin was part of the development of this instrument as well. It was kind of one of the first drum machines, and it was really nice. I'm not going to go through the details of how it works, so I proceed a little bit faster on the presentation, but you can hear how it sounds. This is a presentation by Andrei Smirnov. So it's literally a drum machine, you will see. Yeah, and because of its construction, it produced a lot of polyrhythmic patterns. Again, I'm not going to go so much through the discussion of how it worked or something, but yeah, this was one of the early as well. And there is the RCA Mark III. I think that if you were in that lecture with me in Foundation, remember this cat getting showered with water. If you don't remember the cat getting showered with water, you were not in that lecture because it's just impossible to forget about this cat getting showered with water. But the RCA Mark III was a really large, again, like building size, not building size, but kind of room-sized synthesizer. Was one of the first programmable synths. And let's watch this little video so you can have an idea of what was going on there with the Mark III. Let me just play it from here.
In another field, music can now be produced entirely by electronics. No known instruments are involved. Coded information is punched out. An electronic music synthesizer does the rest.
So this is like the timeline in Ableton or something. I mean, these were just like punch cards that were processing information. Beep, 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 beep.
This is music with a strictly electronic beat.
So there you go. That's a very, very first version of Ableton Live. Cool. And then this is a bit of a sound, like if you don't remember this video, you were not in this lecture because it's impossible to forget. Somebody made this, like decided to put this weird kind of like cat there spinning around. Yeah, sorry. But you see, I mean, this thing is 1950s, guys. Like, I don't think that you knew. Maybe you knew, but I don't think that many of us had the understanding that electronic music was so advanced already back in the 50s. Like, I mean, this thing sounds rudimentary for us, but come on, it could be from a video game that we were playing in the 80s or something. So yeah, the RCA Mark III, Mark II was given to early electronic music composers, and there are a whole bunch of symphonies and electronic music experiments that were generated on the Mark II, sorry. And yeah, it was just a huge machine. It's still available. You can go and watch it in Illinois, I think, in Chicago, near Chicago. Yeah, it's a part of our lives. Now, I remember when I gave this presentation to Foundation, I put this video here just to let us give us a capacity, not a capacity, but to invite us to meditate about how much things have changed. You know, all these electronic music instruments were created in the past, and they were so difficult to find these components to kind of like find pieces of gear that can help us to innovate. I'm talking about the past. But nowadays we have, I mean, this is a electronics market in China where you can just go and buy any kind of oscillator generator, potentiometers, capacitors, any electronic circuits, boards that you want, like interfaces and things. You can even buy them in market. So, I mean, the capacity for us to innovate in the electronic music world has increased and increased and increased and increased. Our relationship with technology just kept advancing, which is pretty cool. Fact, you know, you can even add LEDs to your synth. So, okay, of course, now after this has all happened before the 60s, and what happened around the 60s is that there is a guy called Herald Bode who created many electronic organs and stuff, and he started to create transistors. He started to create instruments with transistors instead of vacuum tubes, and he started to develop the idea of different elements that can be connected in different ways to produce a wide array of sounds, so some sort of proto-modular. And there was a guy who was designing theremin instruments. His name was Robert Moog, and he grabbed the concept of Herald Bode, and he was like, holy shit, like, maybe I can just grab this modular idea and sort of like improve it. And he did this, and he worked together with a guy called Herbert Deutsch. He's a very famous composer, and they popularized the first Moog modular synthesizer. So it was a synth that had a keyboard added to it to make it more musical and more marketable. By the way, Andrei, before you go, I know you have to leave at 4 or something. I remind you that the next lecture on this, this is the last lectures of Styles and Generes. And from now until the end of the course, we're going to have a lot of juicy music production kind of tips, create hints.
Nice.
Yeah, just so you know. I mean, I don't want to bore you guys with this sort of like material, but I thought it was a cool conversation too, just like to discuss it. But I want you to know that next week we will have a lecture. I have it already prepared. I was going to deliver it today. The lecture is called like 20 ways to layer sounds, and we're going to have a lot of things that are more into practice. You know, it's just like this particular subject is 38 lectures, and we are in lecture 25. So yeah, we're maybe like a little bit in the tail end of it. But yeah, just so you know that we're going to leave this sort of theoretical, isolated / philosophical point to go back into music production. I wanted to tell you this before you go, because I said this to Lala before you arrived. Anyways, so this guy, Robert Moog, started like saying like, hey man, like maybe we can just start exploring with these ideas of Herald Bode, and he conceived the very popular Moog modular synthesizers, and this brought humanity to the synth era. So until the 60s, we were not in the synth era. Because synths were sort of like a laboratory thing located in a university or in the laboratories of a company like IBM or something like that. It was something totally isolated from the actual users, you know. And so that triangle of users, repairmen, people, amateur musicians was not there for electronic music. Until the 50s, electronic music was space for scientific exploration. And I think that's my second argument here. Actually, when I built this presentation, I didn't develop this so well, and I want to make some notes here about something I said, something I'm saying. So let me grab this slide and draw some conclusions here at the end, because I remember the first time I delivered this presentation, it just didn't land it like I wanted. So let me put it here. In conclusion. Wait, in conclusion. In conclusion, wait, let me just write this here. Why electronic music is how it is. So I would argue here that point one is instruments are because of the cycle of instruments. Cycle of instruments. Let me put here a note saying that this applies. Let me just delete this and say it like the following ideas apply to the pre-software era, which I think is super influential because anyways, nowadays we use software, but all the music and the aesthetics and the taste that we have was developed in the pre-software era. So it's really important anyways because of the cycle of instruments. Some instruments are created and they popularize years later. So there's some sort of vision that sees the light, a past vision that sees the light in the future. And that's sort of how electronic music sounds. Sort of vision, a sort of past vision that sees the light in the future. I think that's a good way to describe some of the electronic music aesthetics. A past vision that sees the light in the future. Like a past vision of the future that sees the light in a future time, like sees the light years after it was created. Because it takes time for new technologies to be adopted. I think that's one of the reasons why electronic music sounds how it sounds. The second reason, I'm going to change this to life cycle of instruments. The second reason why I think electronic music sounds how it sounds is because of the market forces behind the manufacture of instruments. So what do I mean by that? For an instrument to mature, it needs repairman, it needs music labels, it needs professional musicians, amateur musicians, composers, etc. Without those elements, instruments cannot. I'm going to put here, I'm going to kind of like reshape this a little bit. First point of why I think electronic music sounds how it sounds, because of the instruments created, right? Like, I mean, if you don't create these instruments, you cannot create this electronic music. And it sounds how it sounds because of the instruments. I mean, there is the Moog sound. It's a part of our lives. It's a part of our music genres. So because of the instruments themselves. Now, in order for an instrument to become famous, they need to have a life cycle. And in order for an instrument to become famous, there need to be some market forces that sustain the development of that instrument. So behind the manufactured instruments, they mature, they need composers, professional musicians, etc. And I think that the other reason why electronic music sounds how it sounds is because it started in the academic field. When you hear a square pusher song, like you perceive there, for example, to give an example of a square pusher song, and even some dubstep songs, like they sound like classical music in a way. Like sometimes when you decompose them and build them, of course, when you think about a minimal techno song, we're in a new era, right? But I think that because electronic music started in the academic field, and it was a research kind of like area of music development. This affects a lot why it sounds how it sounds. So we will continue adding some other stuff there as the lecture progresses. So I'm in the 60s. So in the 60s, this guy, Robert Moog, started developing musical instruments. They became popular. And do you remember when the Carlos switch on Bach, guys?
No.
No? Okay, that's really great. So in 1968, something happened that was really important for the development of electronic music, which was a person called Wendy Carlos, who was a man called Walter Carlos that went through a sex change. I just say this not because it's an important point, it's because you will find this man or this lady, sorry, she's still alive and she is now identifies as a woman. You will see this person credited both as Walter Carlos and as Wendy Carlos. So it's the same person. This person, Wendy Carlos, she created in 1968 like a grab the main hits of Bach and she represent them in electronic music. And so the results were amazing. And this helped a lot to popularize the synthesizer as an instrument. It was really amazing, and it was really important thing to make electronic music to become popular in the world. And this is Walter Carlos in that moment showing a Moog synthesizer.
Let me try and show you how we get some of these sounds. First of all, none of them exist as a particular sound as they would on an electronic organ. There's no magic button marked trumpet or violin or...
You see, and she says something like, hey, these synths, they don't have like a button to make a trumpet. You need to build these sounds. I mean, I just want us to pay attention to the language that they were using at the beginning of the synth era. I mean, this video you're seeing is 1970, something like that. So this is 15 years after the invention of the Moog synthesizer.
Drums, you have to build every sound. And to start to build these sounds, you have to start with something pretty simple. And here are the simple things we start with. There are 5 of them. The simplest one of all is something that any lab technician must have
seen. And you see, when she describes like the components of a sound, she immediately talks about a lab technician. And you see, she's even wearing a suit. Like, I mean, it was so much a laboratory thing. It was felt like something that a scientist will use or something.
Seen at one time or another. It's called a sine wave. It's very smooth, very flute-like. A little bit more complicated wave is called sawtooth, and it's called sawtooth because on an oscilloscope screen it looks just like a sawtooth. And this one is a little richer, a little readier, and it resembles a lot of sounds found on home electronic organs.
Well, anyways, I'm not going to go through these videos. I just wanted you to have a feel of Walter/Wendy Carlos. She is amazing, and it's a very special. She also made the soundtrack of The Clockwork Orange, and it is one of the pioneers of electronic music that changed the world forever. And these 2 videos show you how she was searching for sounds and creating them. And she has a Moog modular, and then she also displays another synth, and it's really cool.
Let me try and
in the 70s, the Mini Moog Model D came out, and this is extremely important part of the electronic music history because it was the first portable synthesizer that everybody could just put on a suitcase and take on the tour or on the road. And it also introduced something that nowadays for us is really obvious, which is the pitch wheel. And this allowed musicians to bend notes like guitarists do. And this became really important for new horizons of music. And around that time also there was a synth developed called the ARP 2600, which was built using Moog components. And these were just like different, you know, approaches to how to create synths that were portable, and that this allows people to now take electronic music into the road, and this obviously changed everything. Initially, all of those synths were monophonic, which means that they could only play one note at a time. But as technologies kept advancing, you know, they started being able to stack more gear into one sole place. Because you see, when you have a polyphonic synth, when you see that like Moog modular of Wendy Carlos, this huge thing here, like that will be able to create the sounds for one voice, right? But if you wanted to create the sounds for two voices, you needed a whole another Moog modular. And if you wanted three voices, you needed a third Moog modular. And so it was really expensive to put together polyphonic instruments. And so this meant that most initial electronic music instruments were just monophonic. And yeah, this was an important consideration for electronic music until the technology evolved, so people could create instruments that are multi-voicing that didn't require a whole house to be hosted. So the Mini Moog in particular, it's a really, 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 really important instrument in the history of humanity. This thing changed the history. This is kind of how it looks like when you open it up and service it. Like I told you, one of the things that are important and innovative about this is that they were not using vacuum tubes anymore. They were using transistors to build. And so this changed how you could shrink them and transport them and move them around. So this is just the schematics of a Moog synth, just for fun. And here, I really like to show this video when we watch this presentation. This is a demonstration by the creator of the Moog synthesizer, showing you the Moog synthesizer, the Mini Moog.
The father of the modern synthesizer.
By the way, this, are you there, Lala? Are you
Yes.
there by any chance? This image you see there, that's the telharmonium. That's the inside workings of the telharmonium. That instrument I talked about a while ago, that was like a whole house in the New York Metropolitan Museum. Like this was the inside part of the telharmonium.
The father of...
And so yeah, I mean that would be like this video shows you Robert Moog explaining his instrument. Also talks about Wendy Carlos. This album I told you, Switch On Back, which in the moment I wanna play this because I want you to hear what they said about it.
The Moog modular synthesizer first became widely heard in 1968 on a record called Switched On Back by Walter, now Wendy, Carlos. It was big brother to the best-known synthesizer of all time, the Mini Moog.
So, wait.
This is the last off the production line. It was made in 1980. The last of about 12.
Well, I don't remember in which video it is. I think maybe it's in the previous video that I skipped. When they talk about the album of Wendy Carlos, the Switch On Back, the narrator of this 1970s video says the controversial album, like as if it's something really strange that somebody dared to use electronic music instruments to perform Bach music. And I think that is another reason why electronic music sounds how it sounds. And I'm going to add it here in our list of things that we are putting here in the end. I'm going to say here something, the 0.5. Let me just restart numbering from 0.5. So the 0.5 is because in the beginnings of the electronic music era, people had a hard time to assimilate the electronic sounds. Sort of like your babushka with a phone, but applied to all humanity. applied to whole humanity. Also, I think that one of the reasons why electronic music sounds how it sounds is because tech sounds are alien to us, because we are made of biological material, and these instruments are made with arbitrarily selected metals and plastics. And I also think because and this is maybe the most important part, because there was no precedent before. Great. So let's go back to where we were. We were here. We saw Robert Moog kind of showing his instrument. And well, I mean, I'm going to go a little bit over 4:30. I think I will be ready soon. I'm not so far away from being ready. I'm not so far from finishing. This design of the Mini Moog became kind of timeless, and it set the scene for the story that follows ahead. You know, most synthesizers have 3 oscillators or more than 1 oscillator, then a filter unit, a loudness contour unit, a filter contour unit. And this thing became sort of like ubiquitous in almost all synths after this. Around the 70s, the microprocessor was invented, like I showed you initially, and this allowed in electronic music to start traveling into the digital domain. The components became affordable to produce, and this meant that polyphony could become a reality, you see? And this obviously affected the story of electronic music, because now synths did not have to be only monophonic. And a great example of this is a synth called the Prophet 5 that arrived around the 70s. And yeah, it just like used microprocessors to create polyphony. So we arrived to the 80s, and there are some like legendary synths that we need to add to our list. So far we have the Mini Moog, we have the ARP 2600, we have the Prophet 5, and to this we need to add the Oberheim OBX. Also, other types of synthesis started appearing like Wavetable. They store, because now you had memory and you could start storing things, and then you can start generating sounds with the stored little waveforms. And so Wavetable synths store samples digitally in scannable tables that you can access to grab information, the audio information, and just manipulate it to produce any timbres that you wanted or things like that. Around 1983, Yamaha introduced the DX7, very important synth. We're already in a super polyphonic era, and that's why the 80s sound how it sounds. You see, like electronic music sounds how it sounds because of the instruments that are available. Nowadays, it's a little bit different, and it would be interesting to revisit this lecture in the future to try to see it starting from the software era till now and where we are, but that's another can of worms. So in the 1983, Yamaha came out with the DX7, and this introduced a new type of synthesis called linear FM, which was available now because of more powerful computers. And then about the late 80s, something that is very old, which is called pulse code modulation. Pulse code modulation is what allows you to make a WAV. It's the way we transform analog signals into digital. This became very accessible in the late 80s, and this allowed people to create fully digital synthesizers. So these are some classic synths, like I was mentioning, the Yamaha DX7 around the 80s, the Oberheim OBX, and the Fairlight CMI, which the soundtrack I wrote for the movie kind of contains the majority of the synths I did were with the Fairlight CMI, obviously with a emulator. This guy, you see, it was a whole computer with diskettes, like with disks that you would put inside and load some instances to it. It was quite advanced for the time. The Synclaver, super important instrument, and the Ensoniq ESQ1, super important instrument. The Roller D50, the EMU SP1200, the Korg M1, and the Akai MPC, which thanks to it, we have something that we nowadays call hip-hop, because the Akai MPC was the first sampler that was available around, and people started using it to create new music. And one of those new musics that were created was hip-hop. So again, thanks to the instruments, we get a new type of music. So back to musical and philosophical questions. If you're going to discuss modern electronic music, you also need to talk about a piece of music called the Poème électronique that was developed by a guy called Edward Varese. Edward Varese was a super important pioneer in electronic music. And this piece of music was premiered in 1958 in the pavilion of the World's Fair in Brussels. It was 8 minutes of familiar and unfamiliar sounds. And well, the long story short about the Poème électronique is that so many people watched this, so many people heard this, that it really, really, really shocked the audience that was around, and it sort of like opened up the conversation about electronic music. So I'm not going to discuss so much the Poème électronique. I'm going to move these 2 ideas. I'm actually going to move them in my chronology. I think that it's better to do this and to put this before the 60s because it's more logical in my chronology. I kind of made a mistake there. So here's the 60s, and yeah, I think that this is a good place to put it. And the other thing that I recommend you, here is the Poème électronique, just to hear it for a couple. It's not going to let me to open it, but if you come to the presentation and click it, you will be able to open it. And another thing that one needs to think about when you're thinking about the development of electronic music is a aesthetical current called futurism and electronic music, and how it just kind of went together. Futurism was an aesthetical current that started on the Industrial Revolution, and it kind of like set the tone for the relationship that we have with technology nowadays. So like futurism led us into the belief that technological pioneers were going to be the artists of the future. So it destroyed old traditions, and it just started a totally new aesthetic. And yeah, I mean, this movement was not connected with electronic music. It was something that was happening at the time in art. And when electronic music instruments became available, it heavily influenced the way people started conceiving music, because people wanted to continue the futuristic wave inside the now with electronic music instruments available. So what will follow is, let me just change this and call this conclusions, or like I did with the other, my own thoughts on the matter. So why electronic music is how it is. Obviously, I already did this with you. You know what I'm going to say, but I just want to close this presentation because of the instruments themselves, because of the life cycle of instruments, because of the market forces behind the manufacture of instruments. Basically, for an instrument to become popular, it needed to have all these like components on the marketplace, and that affects the aesthetics, because it started in the academic field. Because in the beginnings of the electronic music era, people had hard time to assimilate electronic music sounds. I would add here something like, because of futurism movements. I would call it like, I'm about to finish, я почти готов мой урок. Сейчас. Я читал, я написал, ребята. Сейчас. Okay. Because of the futurism trends, я в онлайн урок сейчас. Because of the futurism trends, people assimilated. Because of futurism trends, people assumed, better to say like this, assumed that electronic music, that the pioneering art would be the art that assimilates better technology. Also, we discussed that text sounds are alien to us because we are made of biological material, but these instruments are made with arbitrary selected metals and plastics. Because there was no precedent to these sounds before. And there is one important last point, and because of the archaic, I will explain this in a second, revival. So the archaic revival is the emergence of neo-shamanistic culture. So what do I mean by that? Raves and psychedelic culture. I mean, this is another reason why electronic music is how it is. psychedelic culture. But that's a more modern phenomenon. So that kind of concludes the basic ideas of this presentation. Now, Lala, I have here my electronic music selection that I don't want to, I think this is one of the most important parts of the presentation, so I'm just going to go through it quickly. As if we're going to discuss the history of electronic music, I think that these albums are extremely important to discuss, so, and they must be seen by anybody who is thinking about this history. So Switch on Back, we discussed it in the presentation. Autobahn by Kraftwerk, Trans-Europe Express by Kraftwerk, Oxygen by Jean-Michel Jarre, Computer World by Kraftwerk as well, Selected Ambient Works by Aphex Twin, very important. Music Has the Right to Children by Boards of Canada, super important. Homework by Daft Punk, Play by Moby, and Discovery by Daft Punk as well. And these, and well, they're after the 2000s, we will see something more like Fahrenheit Fair Enough by Telephone Tel Aviv, 2001, Vespertine by Björk, 2001, Jogadi by Boards of Canada, Justice, Cross, Untrue by Burial is really great, Oracular Spectacular by Management, Cosmogramma by Flying Lotus, Ufabulum by Square Pusher, Cyro by Aphex Twins, and Amor Apart by Odessa. Now,
Yeah, I know them all.
yes, that's so great. Now,
Yeah.
in here, I put you my selection of things that I like. It's not like things that I think are amazing or something. It's just my selection. So I am recommending a lot to listen to Colossal Squid. He's a very special guy from London. There is some White Rainbow here too. And there is my brother, actually, Drafter, who is a really, really great composer. And this song that I put there is really amazing. It's part of my personal collection. This is Robert Fripp. This album that you will see, listen here, is like from the 60s. It's a really special album. It was made with a kind of like looper system. Boards of Canada, of course, like if you're going to think about the history of electronic music, you need to think about Boards of Canada. I spent a little bit of time talking about Jaga Jazzist because, I mean, many people feel them as a jazz project, but they have like very deep electronic roots. And in this presentation, in this collection of music I put there, I also discussed Julian Winding and Cliff Martinez, which are really special techno composers. And they created together the sound of the Neon Demon that it's so amazing. I also discussed Mac Quayle. He's the creator of the soundtrack of Mr. Robot. I also discussed in my selections here LTJ Bookham. It's a really cool DJ from London that was doing jungle. By the way, Lala, you're making jungle nowadays. You must
Yeah,
listen.
I remember you.
Yeah, I mentioned it to you, remember?
Yeah,
Once.
yeah.
Yeah, it's really amazing. Just don't miss it. And I mean, when we were in the foundation, we did this thing of like creating some tracks, copying some tracks, imitating some electronic music tracks. And these were the tracks I offered back then, and I brought them back here just because I think they're a really cool example of electronic music songs. Recondite, Giorgio Moroder, Logic the Rapper, Bonobo, Harmonia, which is amazing. I really invite you to listen to Harmonia. It's like this album that you will see, listen there, is from 1967, and it's a very, very special selection. And this is Boris Brecha. It's just really cool techno DJ from Poland. Okay, and so what is in the end of this presentation that I put here for you? What is in the end, it's a selection of the basic subgenres of electronic music, like ambient, breakbeat, chiptune, and there is a little explanation of what this genre is about, where it came from, and 3 albums that are a good example of this genre. So there is breakbeat, there is chiptune, there is dubstep, there is drum and bass. I mean, I'm not going to describe them right now because I don't think it's the necessity for this lecture. I just want you to know that this material is there, and I really invite you for your education and to expand your palette of music, that you check out these records if you don't know them. So there is, of course, electro, house music, IDM, industrial, jungle, techno, minimal techno, progressive house, synth pop. I need to add the examples there. Trance, glitch. And as a bonus for anybody who watched this presentation and who wants to expand anything in electronic music, there is a bonus here. So let me put it here, bonus content, synth manuals. I took this from the presentations I built for the first year, and I just put it there as an appendix, you know. Here is like, for example, the ARP 2600, and here is a guide on how to use the ARP 2600 explained like very clearly. You know, it's like, do this, do this, do that. And there are videos also supporting this explanation. And it's not only the ARP 2600, it's also the Cherry Audio Voltage Modular Nucleus. I will come back to this in 1 second. The Roland Jupiter 8 and the Minimoog 5. So all these guides are there. And the last thing that is there is a list of a lot of synths and kind of like how they sound. It's just like a video to listen to them and understand like how they sound, like how does the Lyra sounds, how does the Sequential 8 sounds, how the Polyvox sounds, Omnichord, etc. And that's just extra material. Now, Lala, about the Cherry Audio Voltage Modular Nucleus, if you were not with us when we had this foundation module of synths, I want you to focus on the fact that this voltage modular nucleus of Cherry Audio is a free modular synth, 100% free, super functional, extremely useful to the maximum level of detail modular synth. And I recommend you to download it. Here is a guide on how to use it. If you ever want to use it, you got it there. So yeah, I mean, in our music production of a single course, we took a detour to discuss styles and genres. Like I told you when I started this module, this was designed a little bit to help me out so I could breathe a little bit because of the amount of workload I had. But also I know that in your like history in Moscow Music School, because I know your program very well, you were not like properly, you know, there was not never a proper discussion on styles and genres. And I thought that I could combine this necessity that I needed for a little bit of a break and this lacking that you had to cover these two things. And that was done, delivered. This is the last lecture of this. And like I was telling you, from next week, we will go deeply into tips and tricks on how to produce a single better. And we're going to go to 20 ways to layer sounds. And that's going to be great. I already delivered this presentation today, and it was really amazing. And I hope that you're going to like it when it comes. And last but not least, remind your colleagues to please deliver me my homeworks because they are falling behind. And next week, we will start by listening your tracks, Lala, okay?
Yep, okay.
All right. Woo! That was it. So I hope it was useful in any form.
Yeah, thank you. It was very useful to hear about the
Great.
history and conception.
Yeah, and how
it was interesting.
Yeah, because then when we write music, we can think about it and meditate on why things sounds how it sounds. So lecture 25, if you want to access any of those little nuggets that I put there of tutorials of scenes and stuff, just come to lecture 25 and check it out, okay?
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I wish you a great day.